They didn't invite her to celebrate. They invited her to be humiliated. His black ex-wife, forced to sit among strangers, watching the man she once sacrificed everything for marry someone else. But what they never saw coming was that her presence alone would destroy the wedding before the vows could even be spoken. Where are you watching this video from? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to know. Now imagine this. Every eye in the room waiting for you to break, every whisper cutting into your skin, and then, in one unforgettable moment, the truth crashes down so hard it stops the wedding cold. This is Caroline Parker's story. Caroline Parker had promised herself that she would never cry over Richard Hayes again. She had already spent too many nights curled up on the floor of a one-bedroom flat in South London, choking back sobs after their divorce papers came through. Too many mornings staring into the mirror, asking herself how a man she had sacrificed everything for could throw her aside as if she were nothing. But when the envelope arrived, cream-colored, embossed with gold edges, her hands trembled the moment she saw his name printed neatly on the return address. Richard Hayes. A man she once thought she knew better than anyone. She tore it open with a shaky breath. Inside was the wedding invitation. His wedding. Richard and Emily Clark. At first glance, the words dripped with politeness. Caroline, would be honored to have you celebrate our union on this joyous occasion. But Caroline knew better. This wasn't kindness. This wasn't grace. This was a performance. Richard had always been calculated. And Emily? Caroline remembered the woman well. Wealthy family, society darling, the kind of woman whose smile carried the sharpness of a knife. This invitation wasn't about sharing happiness. It was about parading her, his black ex-wife, in front of their glittering crowd of elite friends and family. It was about showing the world that Richard had moved up. Caroline sat at her small kitchen table, the invitation spread open before her, her chest rising and falling with a storm of emotions. She remembered how it all began years ago, working double shifts at a cafe to pay Richard's tuition fees, skimping on meals so he could have books, supporting him when no one else believed in him. She had been his foundation, his anchor. And when success came knocking, when Richard finally became the man he had dreamed of being, he discarded her without hesitation. He walked away into a world of cocktail parties, tailored suits, and glittering chandeliers, leaving her with nothing but broken promises. Now, he wanted her to sit quietly in the back row and watch him pledge his life to another woman. To witness her replacement. To remind her of what she had lost. Caroline's jaw tightened as she reread the invitation. She could almost hear Emily's voice dripping with false sweetness. We'd love for you to come, Caroline. After all, you were such an important part of his past. The words were poison disguised as sugar. 4 hours, she paced her flat. Should she go? Should she let them win? Let them laugh at her presence? Let them watch her shrink under the weight of whispers and smirks? No. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But she also wouldn't run. Caroline realized something vital in that moment. Avoiding the wedding wouldn't erase the humiliation they intended for her, it would only hand it to them on a silver platter. If she was going to show up, she would not walk in as the abandoned, broken woman they imagined. She would walk in as a woman reborn. She folded the invitation slowly, deliberately, and set it down on the table. A strange calm washed over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of Richard Hayes. She whispered to herself, almost like a vow. If they want me there, I'll give them a reason to remember my presence. And in that moment, Caroline Parker decided she would attend that wedding. But she would not be their victim. She would be something far more dangerous, the witness to their own undoing. The morning of the wedding came cloaked in a grey drizzle, the kind that seemed to whisper doubts into every step. Caroline Parker stood before her mirror, smoothing down the fabric of the navy dress she had chosen. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it carried elegance, dignity, and an understated strength. She had chosen it deliberately. She would not compete with Emily Clark's extravagance, nor would she come dressed as the wounded ex-wife they expected. Caroline didn't adorn herself with glittering jewelry or bright colors. Her armor was her composure, her steady gaze, her ability to stand tall when everything inside her begged to crumble. As the car pulled up to the grand countryside manor, her heart pounded against her ribs. The building was vast, with stone walls draped in ivy, the kind of venue designed to impress. Guests in tailored suits and flowing gowns milled about the courtyard, their laughter a melody of wealth and privilege. Caroline could feel the hush fall as she stepped out. Eyes turned. Conversations stalled. Whispers flitted through the air like darts. There she is. She actually came. Poor thing. Caroline felt every word, every glance prickling against her skin, but she lifted her chin higher. She wasn't here to fight their perception. She was here to prove, to herself, more than anyone, that she no longer lived under their shadow. Inside, the manor gleamed with chandeliers and polished floors. The scent of roses filled the air, mingling with champagne and anticipation. Yet, beneath the grandeur, Caroline felt the chill of hostility. Groups of Emily's friends clustered together, whispering behind manicured hands. One woman, tall and sharp-faced, let her voice rise just enough for Caroline to hear. "Imagine being invited to your ex-husband's wedding. How desperate must you be to show up?" The words stung, but Caroline didn't flinch. She met the woman's eyes, held the stare until the woman blinked and looked away. That moment mattered. It was Caroline reclaiming her ground inch by inch. And then, Richard appeared. He was standing near the staircase, looking immaculate in a tailored black suit. For a fleeting second, his mask slipped, his eyes flickered with surprise at how radiant Caroline looked. But the smirk quickly returned, the same arrogant curl of lips she had once loved and now despised. He gave her a curt nod, like an employer acknowledging a former employee, and then turned back to greet another guest. Caroline's chest tightened. He hadn't even said her name. After everything they had shared, years of building a life together, nights when she believed they were unbreakable, he dismissed her with a nod. That wound cut deeper than any whisper. Then came Emily. Gliding across the room in a gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, Emily Clark was every bit the society darling. Her smile was perfect, practiced, polished, but her eyes were ice. She leaned forward and kissed Caroline lightly on the cheek, the gesture more performance than affection. "Caroline," Emily purred, her voice dipped in sweetness. "You look lovely. I wasn't sure you'd come." There was venom laced in those words, disguised with charm. Caroline knew it, Emily knew it, and the crowd around them knew it. "I wouldn't miss it," Caroline replied calmly, her tone smooth, her expression unreadable. Emily's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. She whispered, low enough for only Caroline to hear. "I thought it might give you closure. Seeing how happy he is now." Caroline's stomach twisted, but she refused to give Emily the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she gave the faintest smile and whispered back, "Happiness has a way of showing its cracks." Emily's eyes narrowed. For the first time, her confidence wavered. Caroline drifted away from the couple, her presence still pulling glances from every corner of the room. She found a quiet spot near the back, breathing in deeply, steadying her heart. She had survived worse. She could survive this. But as the string quartet began to play and the guests started moving toward the ceremonial hall, Caroline couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something was building. The air around her felt heavier, as though the truth itself was pressing against the walls, waiting for the perfect moment to break free. And Caroline didn't yet know it, but the cracks Emily dismissed so casually were already there. And before this day was over, those cracks would shatter everything. The ceremonial hall was a cathedral of wealth and pretense. High arched ceilings gleamed with golden light, and 1,000 roses lined the aisle as though beauty could disguise the emptiness of intention. Guests found their seats in hushed excitement, the air thick with perfume and privilege. Caroline Parker walked slowly to her place at the back, her heels clicking softly against marble floors that seemed to echo louder than they should. She had barely sat when the whispers began again. She must regret every choice that led her here. Imagine being left behind like that. Poor thing, she's still holding on. Every word was a blade. Caroline sat straight, eyes forward, hands folded calmly in her lap, but inside, the voices scraped against old scars. It wasn't just the judgment of strangers, it was the cruelty of knowing Richard and Emily had orchestrated this. They wanted her here, surrounded by eyes that would measure her worth in comparison to Emily's perfection. And then came Emily herself, gliding down the aisle before the ceremony truly began, pausing just long enough to lean toward Caroline. Her voice dripped with sweetness, but her words were poisoned. "Closure, Caroline. That's what this is. I thought you should see for yourself what real happiness looks like." Caroline's chest tightened, her pulse roaring in her ears. The audacity, the arrogance. Yet, instead of snapping back, she gave Emily the faintest smile and murmured, "Happiness has a way of revealing its truth in time." Emily stiffened, her smile faltering. For the first time that day, Caroline saw uncertainty flicker across the other woman's face. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. Still, the whispers continued. Richard's family eyed her with disdain, their hushed tones just loud enough. She doesn't belong here. She's nothing but a shadow. Caroline felt every word, but she refused to shrink. She had promised herself, no more tears for Richard Hayes. The ceremony began. Richard stood tall at the altar, his smile polished, his charm shining under the chandeliers. To everyone else, he was the image of success. But Caroline knew the man behind the mask, the selfishness, the hunger for status, the lies he had perfected over the years. As the officiant began speaking, Caroline tried to steady her breathing. Yet, something about the atmosphere shifted. A ripple of unease swept across the room. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she noticed it. Guests turning, murmuring, eyes darting toward the side entrance. A man, mid-40s, sharply dressed in a gray suit, stepped forward. His voice cut through the ceremony like thunder. Before this farce continues, the truth needs to be heard. Gasps erupted across the hall. Emily froze, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Richard's smile evaporated, his face draining of color. The man held up a folder of documents. His voice, steady and cold, carried across the room. Richard Hayes is a fraud. He has lied to investors, stolen money, and built his so-called success on deceit. And I have the proof right here. The silence that followed was electric. The whispers that once mocked Caroline transformed into sharp intakes of breath, horrified gasps, scandalous murmurs. Every eye turned not on her, but on Richard, the golden groom whose perfect life was unraveling in real time. Caroline's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange, quiet relief. She didn't smile, she didn't move. She simply sat there, watching the carefully constructed facade collapse. For so long, Richard and Emily had wanted her presence to be a humiliation. Instead, her presence became witness to his downfall. Emily's hand slipped from Richard's arm. Her face, once glowing with pride, was pale and stricken with disbelief. And in that moment, Caroline Parker understood something powerful. Sometimes, revenge doesn't require action. Sometimes, the truth itself is enough to stop a wedding cold. The room seemed to collapse in on itself. Moments earlier, chandeliers sparkled above like symbols of celebration, but now their golden light only illuminated panic. Guests erupted into shocked murmurs, their whispers turning into a storm that echoed against marble walls. Richard Hayes, the man who had always prided himself on control, stood frozen at the altar. His jaw clenched, eyes darting to the man in the gray suit who still held the folder high. "This is ridiculous," Richard barked, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "A lie. Nothing but lies." But the man did not falter. Calm, precise, he began pulling out sheets of paper, bank records, falsified contracts, signatures that tied Richard to fraudulent accounts. Every document was another nail in the coffin of his carefully curated image. Emily Clark, radiant in her gown only minutes earlier, looked like porcelain about to shatter. Her hands shook so violently that petals fell from her bouquet. She turned to Richard, her voice breaking, barely more than a whisper. "Tell me it isn't true." Richard's face twisted. He tried to grab her hand, but Emily recoiled as though his touch burned. The audience was no longer watching a wedding, they were witnessing a collapse. Caroline Parker sat silently in the back, her heart steady, her breath measured. She had no part in this exposure. She hadn't lifted a finger, but she couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that pulsed through her veins. For once, Richard's lies were not hidden behind charm and polished suits. They were spread bare for everyone to see. Gasps turned into condemnation. Guests who had once sneered at Caroline now whispered about Richard's downfall. Fraud. Everything was a lie. His career is finished. Richard's voice grew louder, more desperate. He stepped away from the altar, sweat gathering at his brow. This is an ambush. None of this is real. But his words rang hollow, crumbling under the weight of evidence. Emily's mother, seated in the front row, rose to her feet in outrage. "You humiliated us," she hissed, her voice carrying across the hall. Her family name, built on spotless reputation, was now tethered to scandal. Emily's father shook his head, pulling his daughter protectively toward him. The alliance they had imagined between Richard's ambition and Emily's wealth dissolved in an instant. The officiant, stunned and uncertain, closed his book. The ceremony could not continue. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sharp crack of Emily's voice. "Call it off. All of it. This wedding is over." Richard's face crumpled. He turned, eyes scanning desperately across the crowd, as if searching for someone, anyone, to stand by him. But no one moved. The powerful friends he had gathered, the colleagues he had impressed, even Emily herself, everyone recoiled. His empire of lies had no foundation to hold it. And then, as if pulled by instinct, Richard's gaze landed on Caroline. For a fleeting second, their eyes locked. There was no arrogance in his expression now, no smug dismissal. Only fear. Only the recognition that the woman he had once betrayed was here, watching him stripped of everything. Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She didn't offer him the solace he sought. She simply held his gaze with calm detachment, then turned away. That small act, that refusal to acknowledge him, cut deeper than any words could have. The ceremony dissolved into chaos. Guests rushed to leave. Journalists who had been invited for the spectacle now scribbled furiously. Emily fled the hall with her family trailing behind. Richard stood abandoned at the altar, his hands trembling, his future evaporating before his eyes. And Caroline? She remained steady, unmoved, a quiet pillar amidst the ruins. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't orchestrated his downfall. But fate had delivered it before her eyes, and she understood the poetry of it. The very stage that was meant to shame her had become the scene of his undoing. The wedding that was meant to prove his victory could not proceed. Because there was nothing left to celebrate. The hall that once glittered with laughter and champagne had transformed into a battlefield of whispers, gasps, and scattered footsteps. The wedding guests were no longer witnesses to love, they were spectators of ruin. Richard Hayes stood at the altar, his once confident posture crumbling. The documents that proved his fraud were still clutched in the hands of the man who had exposed him, but the damage was already done. The whispers had turned into verdicts. His colleagues whispered about ruined deals. His in-laws muttered about disgrace. His name, once a symbol of ambition, now sounded like a stain. Emily Clark, her gown trembling with every step, had fled the scene. Her family trailed behind her, their faces pale with rage and shame. The union that was supposed to secure wealth and power had disintegrated in minutes. And in the middle of it all, Caroline Parker remained seated, her spine straight, her head held high. She could feel Richard's gaze flicker toward her again and again. He wanted something, anger, pity, maybe even acknowledgement. But she refused him all of it. Instead, she embodied the one thing he could never take from her, composure. For years, Caroline had been the woman who sacrificed, who bent herself to fit his ambitions, who allowed his needs to swallow her dreams. But not anymore. Today, her silence became her sharpest weapon. As the guests continued to murmur, Caroline rose slowly from her seat. Every eye in the room seemed to follow her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she carried herself with a quiet authority that no scandal could overshadow. She walked forward, not toward Richard, but toward the exit. Yet, as she passed him at the altar, their eyes locked one final time. Richard's lips parted, as though he wanted to speak, to plead, to explain, but nothing came out. For once, the man who always had an answer, always had a way to charm or manipulate, was rendered speechless. Caroline stopped just long enough to whisper words that only he could hear. Be careful what you build on lies. They collapse faster than you think. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. But it carried the weight of truth, a truth Richard could not escape. Then she stepped away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own making. Around her, the very guests who had mocked her earlier now watched in silence. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with regret for their whispers. Caroline didn't need their approval. She hadn't come for them. But the shift in their eyes, the recognition that she had endured humiliation only to rise above it, was undeniable. Her dignity became her revenge. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't plotted. She hadn't lifted a hand to ruin Richard Hayes. She simply carried herself with grace, and in the face of that grace, his collapse looked even uglier. When Caroline reached the exit, the man in the grey suit, the one who had exposed Richard, nodded at her. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was clear. He recognized her strength. She wasn't part of Richard's deceit, nor part of his downfall, but she had been the one to bear the weight of his betrayal the longest. Now, justice had finally caught up, and she was free of it. As Caroline stepped out into the cool evening air, the first stars appearing in the sky, she felt lighter than she had in years. She realized something profound. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it looks like walking away while your enemy drowns in the truth they tried to bury. And tonight, her silence echoed louder than any outburst could have. The night air outside the manor was cool, crisp, and infinitely quieter than the storm Caroline Parker had left behind. She stepped down the grand stone staircase, the sound of her heels tapping in rhythm with her heartbeat. For the first time in years, that beat wasn't heavy with regret or bitterness. It was steady, calm, and free. Behind her, chaos still brewed. Guests scrambled to leave before their names were entangled in scandal. Reporters whispered eagerly about ruined reputations. The once proud Clark family retreated into the shadows, furious that their daughter's dream wedding had turned into a public disgrace. And Richard Hayes? He was left inside, standing in the ruins of a life he had built on lies. But Caroline didn't need to see any more. His downfall was no longer her burden to carry. She paused at the edge of the driveway, looking up at the night sky. For a moment, she remembered the girl she once was. The young woman who had believed in Richard, who had worked nights and days to keep his dreams alive, who had thought love meant losing herself for someone else. That woman had been betrayed, discarded, and humiliated. But the woman who walked away tonight was different. She was not broken. She was not lesser. She was whole. As her car pulled forward, Caroline slid inside, her reflection in the window catching her eye. There was no trace of the tears that had once haunted her. Instead, she saw resolve. Strength. A quiet beauty that had nothing to do with dresses or diamonds and everything to do with dignity. Inside the manor, Richard's voice could still be faintly heard, pleading, shouting, desperately trying to cling to what had already slipped through his fingers. Emily's sobs echoed faintly too, muffled and sharp, the sound of dreams dissolving into dust. But those sounds no longer belonged to Caroline's world. She whispered to herself, almost like a promise. This is the last time I'll ever let him take a piece of me. Her car pulled away from the estate, headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying her toward a future that, for the first time in years, felt entirely her own. And though she hadn't come seeking revenge, she understood now that life had delivered it anyway. Richard had invited her to witness his triumph, but what she witnessed instead was his undoing. He had tried to shame her, but she left untouched. Unshaken. Elevated. That was the sweetest justice of all. Dignity can be the sharpest weapon. Patience can be the sweetest revenge. And sometimes, the best answer to betrayal is not anger, not shouting, not fighting, but walking away while the world sees the truth for itself. Tell me, if you were Caroline, what would you have done? Would you have walked out in silence, or delivered the final word? Drop your thoughts below, I'm listening. Stories like this remind us that dignity can be the sharpest form of revenge. Hit that like button if you believe silence can be more powerful than words. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story of Justice Served. Now tell me, what do you think hurts more? Being betrayed in private, or being exposed in front of everyone you tried to impress? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm curious to see where you stand.